makers, I'm Katherine from Minerva, and I wanted to share with you a sew-along on how to make the Southbank Sweater by Nina Lee, which happens to be one of the kits that we have available for you. So let's get into it. Now, before we get stitching, we need to gather up all of our materials. Now, if you ordered a kit from us, this is exactly what you're going to get and also what you're going to need to get started. So first up, we have our fabric. And so I selected this textured cable knit fabric, which has 30% stretch. Now the pattern calls for any fabric that has greater than 20% stretch. So this fabric is perfect. It is also a decent weight of fabric so that if you are making the dress version, it is going to drape and lie very nicely, as well as be incredibly flattering. Next up, we are going to get a paper version of the pattern of the Southbank sweater and dress. And this pattern has a couple of different views. You have the dress view, which goes to about mid-thigh, maybe a little lower. And then you have the shirt view, which is the view that I decided to make. And then you have an option for a cropped view, if that's something that you desire. Now, in terms of fit on this, it was designed with a drop shoulder. And so what that means is that the seam isn't going to end right at the top of your shoulder. It's actually going to come down just slightly. And I find this gives a bit more of a casual look to the garment, and I think is really flattering with this style. You also have a funnel neckline, which is essentially like a turtleneck neckline. You can wear it up with it a little bit higher, but I like to roll mine down so that you have a shorter band right here. And I find that it really reminds me of those vintage 1960s vibes. Next up is the fact that there is some positive ease built into this garment. So you are looking at about 1 inch of positive ease in the bust and about 6 inches of positive ease in the waist. Now what that means is that it's going to fit a little bit more slouchy because knit garments tend to have a negative ease, especially if they're close fitting. And I find that this has just the right amount of positive ease for it to be incredibly flattering, yet not look too casual. So you could really dress this sweater or dress up or down. Next up in the kit, we have some clear elastic. Now we're going to use that clear elastic to stabilize our shoulder seams, especially if you have a more slinky knit. Now this knit is pretty stable. I still decided to do it just because it is going to increase the wear of the garment in the long term. And next up, we have some jersey needles that are included in here. And we also have some stretch twin needles that we are going to be using for our top stitching. And then we are going to have some matching Gutermann thread to create your masterpiece. And as always, Minerva is going to include a project planner. So if you want to do some sketching and plan out the project and write down any adjustments that you needed to make to the pattern, this is a great place where you can store that and keep it in a binder somewhere else. Now, once we've got all of our supplies together, the next thing you're going to do is wash and dry your fabric in the manner in which you are going to wash and dry the finished garment. Once you have that done, let's get over to the pattern itself. Step 1, cutting your fabric. So with the pattern, we are going to trace it out. Now you can cut out your pattern pieces, but I always prefer to trace it out, and I am using some tracing paper here and a pencil to trace out my size. Don't forget to put all of the pattern markings as well as the grain lines on those pattern pieces. And once we have it all traced out, the next thing that I like to do is set it up to begin cutting it out. Now I am going to be folding this fabric, not necessarily where it folds completely in half. I'm going to maintain that grain line because it's important that we are following the grain line for the sweater so you have the degree of greatest stretch going in the right direction. That being said, because this is a cable knit pattern and it does have that textured pattern to it, if you will, I decided that I wanted to ensure that I have the large rope cable pattern going exactly in the center front on both my bodice front and bodice back pieces. So I am just placing that down, and I'm placing some metal washers down here so that I can have it exactly where I need it to lie, and then I'm placing my pattern piece on top. Now, this is a directional print, so you'll notice that the cable fabric, the ropes go in one direction. So you want to make sure that they are going in the same direction for both your front and your back piece, as well as your sleeves, so you have a nice cohesive garment. So the easiest way to cut this out would be with a rotary cutter and pattern weights, but you could also pin it and use your tailor's shears to cut this out as well. So with this, we also want to ensure that we are transferring our pattern markings. So I'm just using a pattern notcher to notch out the markings on the pattern pieces. And then I'm going in and using my shears to create notches along those pattern markings that we can later match up on our fabric. So once you have all your pieces cut out, I will meet you back here where we can discuss some sewing. Seam finishing options. Now, before we get into the sewing, I thought I would touch just a wee bit on the seam finishes. So because this is a knit pattern, if you're using your domestic sewing machine, you're going to want to use a zigzag stitch to sew the seams, because a zigzag stitch will allow your stitches to stretch with the fabric. If you were to use a straight stitch, those stitches are going to pop and it's not going to be as durable. Now you can also use a serger to achieve the same results. So I wanted to show you what the zigzag stitch looks like, as well as the surged stitches look like with the seam, both on from the right side as well as from the wrong side, and what that looks like. Now, because this is a knit, your edges are not going to fray, so you don't need to do anything more than that original zigzag stitch if you're using that domestic sewing machine. So I, for the tutorial, will continue to use a serger just because that is my personal preference, but anywhere that I am using a serger, you can also use that same zigzag stitch here that I had used before here. The shoulder seams. So for this, we are going to stabilize them with the clear elastic that was included in the kit. So you're going to open up the clear elastic, and one tip when using this is you want to pre-stretch it. So go ahead and give it a nice good tug for at least the amount that we are going to use for our shoulder seams. So we're going to measure out a length of elastic that extends beyond the shoulder seams on both sides, and we're going to cut out one for each shoulder. And so I am just going in here and making sure that we're pre-stretching this before we stitch it on. Now you want to stitch this to the wrong side of your fabric, so go ahead and lie it down here. Now you don't need to use clips. You could use this just by hand at the machine, but I do find that clips help to keep it in place a little bit better than just attaching it by hand. So go ahead and zigzag this on. So I am just using a regular zigzag stitch here and a jersey needle. So you are just going to change that needle, and it's very crucial that you are using the correct needle or you're going to have some skipped stitches. So when you get to here, you are just going to make sure you have a little bit of tail hanging out the back, and if you have a Teflon foot, that will help it to glide over your elastic just a little bit better. And then you are just going to stitch along here with the zigzag, just trying to keep that elastic as close to that edge as you can. And then when you are done, I am just trimming off those tails that we had so that everything lines up nicely. And you are going to attach it to the back of the sweater. Then you're going to attach the front and the back of your sweater together at those shoulder seams here. So I am just going to lay this nice and flat. You can see we have the elastic on the one side, and we're going to place it right sides together right at that shoulder seam. And then you're going to attach that with either pins or clips. And with knit garments, I do find that clips tend to work a little bit better unless you do have ballpoint pins. And once you have that, you are just going to stitch your shoulder seams. So I'm going to use a serger to serge them together. That being said, if you have a domestic sewing machine, you could use that lightning stitch or zigzag stitch to attach them together on the shoulder seam here. And it should look like this. Next up, we have insetting the sleeves. So we have 2 notches on the back and 1 on the front. We want to ensure that that shoulder seam is pointed towards the back or the side with the double notches. Then you're going to get your sleeve piece out and you're going to place it right sides together. So we've got the single notch to the front, a single notch to mark the center seam, and that double notch. So pin the double notch first because that is the one that is going to denote that you have the right sleeve. The next single notch goes along the shoulder seam, making sure that it is pointed towards the back. And then the next single notch matches up to the single notch on the front of the sweater. Then you're just going to go ahead and match up the ends of the sleeve to the ends of the sweater and just adding a couple more clips in between to make sure nothing spreads out. You're going to do that for both sides and stitch that in place. Next comes the side seams. So for the side seams, your sleeve is all attached and you want to attach it right sides together with the front and the back. Match up that underarm seam first and then go ahead and pin the edge of the sleeve and the edge of your sweater and then distribute those clips or pins in between. And you're going to do the same for the other side, just making sure that when you have that underarm seam, it is pointing down towards the end of the sleeve. That is going to feel the nicest when you are wearing them, and it's going to help reduce any irritation in that sleeve area if you have it going the opposite way, because that is the way that your arm is going to go into the sleeve. So you want your seam going that direction. So stitch that up. And I am once again going to use my serger to do this because it makes a nice quick work and it is a nice crisp seam. And so just going on, and I'm taking off a minimal amount, maintaining that seam allowance that is noted in the pattern. And you can see that it looks like this. And now we're just going to turn it right side out and it's really starting to look like a sweater now. And now we are going to move on to the roll neck or the turtleneck or funnel neck. So with this, we have a double notch on the one end here. We're going to place it right sides together along the small side, and we're just going to stitch that in place. So once that is stitched in place, we are going to fold it right side out, and then with wrong sides facing, we are going to match up the 2 back seams that we have, making sure that that seam isn't twisted inside. And then right where we have that notch, we are going to match that up. And then we're just going to quarter it as well, just matching up along the sides here. Then we're going to pop on over to our sewing machine and stitch that in place with a zigzag stitch. This is just to base this together so that nothing shifts when we go to attach it to our sweater. So I just used a regular zigzag here and I didn't bother to backstitch at all. And it looks just like this, nice and stretchy. Now next you have a front and a back to this roll neck. So you notice that where you have those notches, one side is larger than the other side. That larger size between the notches is going to be the front. So you're going to match up the notches to those side shoulder seams. You're going to clip them in place, and then you are going to match up the front and the back of that roll neck, making sure that you haven't flipped it around backwards. If it's not fitting nicely and you're finding you have excess on one side and having to stretch too far on the other, you have to flip it around. Now stitch that in place. I used my serger, and if you are using a serger and you are stitching in the round, we need to tie off those tails. So clip those tails nicely and then get out a darning needle, thread those serger tails through, and then go back through that stitching. And I actually like to go through the fabric slightly just to really hold it off. And then clip those ends and they aren't going anywhere. And your roll neck is all completed and it should look a little something like this. Now for the sleeve cuffs. So with this, we are going to take our cuffs and we are going to fold them in half. And then we are just going to stitch down the one side so it looks just like this. And then with wrong sides together, we are going to fold it in half, just like so. You want to make sure that those seams are both pointed in the same direction and nothing is twisted, because that will drive you bonkers on your cuffs. Next, I am making some notches to denote the halfway point on the sleeve, just so it makes it a little easier to fit it in. So you can see that I have the seam here, and I am going to match up the seam. And so with the raw edges matching and right sides together, I am going to match up the seam on the cuff with the seam on the sleeve, and my cuff is going one way and the seam on the sleeve is going the other way. So though they're not necessarily nesting, what this does is help to reduce some of that bulk so that you don't have a really big bulky area right along there. And then we're just going to distribute our sleeve cuff along the sleeve. You shouldn't have to stretch it too much, and stitch that up. Next is the bottom band. So with the bottom band here, we are just going to fold this up 1 inch, and I'm just using my seam gauge here and some clips. So I am not finishing off the bottom of my seams because, of course, knit fabrics don't fray, so we don't have to worry about finishing that. And I am just distributing that, going all along the edges here. And it should look like that. And then you are going to get ready to top stitch that. And so in the kit, it comes with a nice twin needle here for you to use to top stitch the cuffs as well as the bottom band. And now for top stitching finishes. Now that we have the hem all pinned in place, I wanted to talk to you about finishing the top stitching on this shirt or dress if you're making that version. Now, you could continue using your regular jersey needle and use your zigzag stitch to hem all the way around. That being said, if you got the kit, it included a twin needle, and you want to make sure you use one that is made for stretch or knit fabric, not a regular twin needle, because you're going to get skip stitches. Now with this, we are going to set up our sewing machine so that you can use your twin needle. So I wanted to show you really quickly how you're going to do that. So the first thing that you're going to do is you are going to take this little attachment here, and this is going to be clipped onto where you load your bobbin, and this will create an area for your second spool to go on, because with a twin needle we have 2 needles on the top that need to get threaded through. So what I have done is I wound up an extra bobbin with that same color thread, and then I'm using my regular spool of thread along the top, and then we are going to thread it just as normal. And so I like to, you could thread them both at the same time, but because with the tension plates, I like to thread them individually and go through and just really make sure that that thread is going through your tension discs appropriately, and then thread the left and then the right needle and pull that through and make sure that you have a matching color bobbin thread on the bottom. Now, each machine is a little bit different. Now with my machine, I just need to go into my settings, go down a couple, and then click on the twin needle mode. Now, if you have a different machine, it may be slightly different for you. You may have to flick a button. Just read your instruction manual and it'll tell you how you can switch that settings to achieve that twin needle. So then when we are doing our top stitching, we are going to be top stitching from the right side, because the 2 lines of stitching are going to be stitched along the top. And then once we are done stitching that, I wanted to show you what the right and wrong side look like on this. So on the right side of this, you have the 2 lines of top stitching, and then when we flip it over to the wrong side, you are going to see a little zigzag that goes between the 2, which is our bobbin threads. And so that's what this looks like, and you've got sort of a narrow twin needle coming down. Now, I wanted to show an alternate method as well for top stitching this, and that is using the cover stitch machine. Now, not everybody has a cover stitch machine, but this process, you just run it through pretty much the same as you would your twin needle, and it just gives you a different look on the back, which looks more like a overlocked or serged edge, and you have the option of doing narrow and wider twin needle top stitching. So you've got 3 options of how you're going to hem your top. Let's get back to that tutorial. hemming. So we are just going to use the twin needle we just installed to hem this up, and we have a 1-inch seam allowance, so just make sure you line that up on the guide for your stitch line here. And when you are done, it should look a little something like this with a cute little zigzag on the back. And now for the reveal. We are all done stitching up the Southbank sweater. I'm so excited to see all of your makes. Now, if you haven't created an account here on Minerva yet, do consider doing that. It's completely free, and it's a great place where you can share your makes as well as check out other makers and grab inspiration from them. If you do decide to share this, don't forget to use hashtag Minerva Kits as well as hashtag Nina Lee Southbank Sweater Kit. And you can check out any of those hashtags for more inspiration on these sweater kits. And if you want to check out me personally, you can find me at Sheer Stitchery, and I will leave a link to my Minerva profile down below. And don't forget, as always, I will link all of the information that you will need to create this exact same sweater down below. And I am also wearing my ginger jeans in some of the photos, if you are wondering, so I will leave a link to that post as well. I had a lot of fun sharing this all with you guys, and if you have any questions, do let me know in the comments down below, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Until next time, makers, let's get our sewspiration on.